Hello and welcome to The Bottom Line. My name is Dana Connors. I'm pleased to be your host of this monthly program brought to you by the Maine State Chamber of Commerce. This month, as in the past, we're going to take a look at some of the ideas, issues, and initiatives at work in our state helping to improve our economy and the lives of Maine people. And with the legislature in session, halfway, well, actually a little more than halfway through the session, we're going to focus on that for this month's program. And here to help me do that is a team that you're familiar with. It's my advocacy team, Peter Gore, Linda Caprera, and Ben Gilman. Welcome back, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So nothing's happened to the legislature because all three of you are here. Actually, let's begin. We've had 4 months behind us in this session, 2 months to go before the adjournment that's expected the end of January. We know that each session has their own dynamic, their own personality, if you will. How would you gauge where we are in this session related to the number of bills, progress made, where we stand, what's left to do? Pete, you want to kick it off?
I think the legislature is probably where they ought to be. They may be a little behind, and they're looking at trying to finish up their committee work within the next 2 weeks.
Yep.
So all bills come out of committee, and then they've got another a week, I think, before all bills are actually supposed to then be on the floor for discussion. But, you know, as you mentioned, we're 4 months in. We have 2 months, roughly 2 months left, and they're the most important part of the entire session of the last 2 months. I mean, you've gone through the process of getting bills in a position where now the institution can debate the merits of them, and also there's all the behind-the-scenes work that goes on finalizing and negotiating what the budget will look like, and those handful of super important bills that await final disposition.
Yep.
What about the rest of you? How do you see it? Same way?
Well, I mean, the budget right now appropriations is entering their final stage of negotiations, if you will, on the budget. And over the next several weeks, they're going to be really concentrating on those contentious issues, like the 3% surcharge, education funding. You know, they've kind of gotten a lot of stuff off the table, things that they can agree on, and they voted on those. But now, over the next few weeks, really it's going to hit the meat. And I would think they have to vote something out by the 26th. That's what their direction is, and that leaves it right.
Yep.
And that leaves it 2 weeks to print. So we're talking about, you know, the second week of June. So it's really and really the whole thing is what the Revenue Forecasting Commission is going to come out with the beginning of next week, because that's going to determine how much they need, how much they can spend, that type of thing. So that's going to play into it.
This much we know for sure. There's a lot more requests than there are dollars available.
Oh, there will be.
Always is.
Always is.
So Ben, anything to add to that you see that puts us out of what I would classify as more normal than not?
No, I'd say we are probably in a good place for the legislative session. They've gone through about 1,550 bills so far. We've got a couple hundred left to go, which is about normal for this time of year with a few weeks to go. And I think one unique thing about the Maine legislature is every bill sees the light of day. Every bill has a public hearing, and every bill goes through the process. You don't see that in every state. But so with all that, you know, taking place, they've handled over 1,500 pieces of legislation so far, with a couple hundred left to go. So we're in a good spot, I think, heading into the last couple weeks of committee work. And then, as they've already mentioned, then we get into the negotiating part and the interesting parts of the session. So,
as I said at the outset, I mean, every session we have come to know that there's a certain personality, certain priorities that emerge that's being fundamental to that session. This is the first year, the longer year, the one that budgets get set and so forth. But I found that, and I'd be interested in your reaction to this, I found that this year, unlike any other year that I can remember, the referendums of the past November have dominated up until this point in time the real discussion, the debate, what's been talked about, what the focus has been. Let's do a little update as to where each of those issues are. Let's start with marijuana. That was the first one we heard in this session. Pete, you have followed that within the workplace, and you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, the MLA passed in November, and the first thing the legislature had to do in January was fix it to make it at least operable. And And the primary fix they had to apply was to not allow people under the age of 21 to buy marijuana, which is retail marijuana, which is what the MLA did when it was passed in November. And then the second thing they did was to take a look at it and say, this is a super complex issue, and we're going to build a law out of whole cloth. And the 30 pages that are the MLA really don't give us any kind of a roadmap to do that. And, oh yeah, by the way, we've already got 50 to 60 different titles dealing with marijuana submitted for consideration. So we need to give ourselves more time. So they gave themselves an additional 3 months, I believe. So February of 2018 now, instead of 4 months. I guess it was November 1st was what the MLA said.
We'll leave the high math to Linda.
Yeah, exactly. And then,
You're smart.
And then, exactly. And then what they did was to establish a joint select committee that on marijuana legalization implementation. It's a 17-person committee. Joint select committee. There's a million of them, trust me. And it's a 17-person committee drawn from a variety of the different other joint standing committees that would have dealt with marijuana. So criminal justice and veterans and legals and labor commerce research, at any rate. And all the marijuana legislation is being funneled there. And so they have spent their time going through what the existing law is, what the medical marijuana law is, what other states have done in an attempt to start to build the groundwork for a workable piece of state statute.
Yeah, sounds like absolutely
It's a
the
ton
right
of
thing
work.
to do and
Oh,
a lot of
yeah.
work to do. Linda, you want to pick up on that? You want to talk about question 2, which we
Yeah.
know to be the 3%
Well, I mean,
in education?
as we know, there was a huge public hearing, a joint public hearing before Appropriations and Taxation a few months
Right.
ago. A lot of folks showed up and urged the committee to overturn that law. Both committees actually, Appropriations kicked it back to Taxation. Taxation worked it for about a month, and then they kicked it back with their recommendations to Appropriations, where it sits right now. And there were about 4 or 5 bills that dealt with, overturning the law, putting it back out to referendum, using, marijuana money and cigarette money to fund it. There was a, whole different combinations of bills that were out there, and we testified on Senator Dowd's bill. So it's
Let me just explore that a bit, because we have been front and center on that issue as
Absolutely.
leading a coalition called Keep Maine Competitive. Our position has been really to support more money for education, which was part of it, and we also embrace there are certain reforms that we feel need to be addressed. Disadvantaged kids throughout the state. Every school system shouldn't
Right.
be treated the same. But it's the 3% that we have issues with, trying to find a better alternative
Right.
that has least impact on our economy. And I think what you very ably brought out was that aside from that, which seemed to be the prominent position that
Right.
people are trying to wrestle with, there were other alternatives. Some people wanted to replace it entirely or to roll it back, if you will. And so, yeah, it's taken a lot of time and a lot of priority in this
But I
session.
think the Keep Maine Competitive coalition really has made an impact, and I think you're seeing that right now as we enter into the last phases of this whole, this
Yep.
this
Yep.
session. So
So,
Ben?
the other half of that, I think everyone has a sense of when question 2 passed the referendum that people voted for more funding for education, but they didn't vote for that at the expense of our economy with
Right.
having the
Exactly.
highest income tax state. So the Education Committee, where I spend a lot of my time, has focused on the 55% of how do we get to that number. A lot of pieces of legislation have gone in there, and I think they've done a good job, the committee, of kind of managing that. Of their belief is we need to get to 55% through the education budget this session. The committee actually voted unanimously to supporting a budget with 55% in it, which is no small,
Yeah, exactly.
hurdle to get over in the legislative process. But with that being said, it all depends on what 55% is.
Exactly.
So we're going to spend some
What
time,
is
I think, debating that. And some of the issues you brought up, Dana, of disadvantaged youth, Title I funding for some of the rural communities to ensure that the money gets there. We're going to have to look at the funding formula a little bit. But we're going to have to figure out what's in that 55% box, because that will be one of the last pieces of the budget negotiation
Right.
that goes
Yeah.
on. And I think is going to be the key cog of us fixing this referendum problem. We've already dealt with marijuana, of correcting that. You know, one referendum's gone to the Supreme Court for a solemn occasion on the ranked choice voting. So all these referendums are being dealt with in the legislature.
Yeah.
And the question, too, will be dealt with in the budget process, and that education will be the key piece of it, of getting to that 55% number.
Before we take a break, I want to deal with the third of the three referendum that has really also received a lot of attention. And Pete, you've been very involved in this, and that's the minimum wage, of course. Where do we stand at the moment on that?
Well, there was a huge public hearing, the longest public hearing I've ever been part of. It was 15 hours long on the tip credit and a variety of other proposals to change the minimum wage. And at this point, there was a huge outpouring of support to reinstate the tip credit, and that was really driven by servers in the industry. You know, you had probably 200 different servers show up, and that's just unheard of at a public hearing, and testifying for 12 hours on a hearing, and then you had another couple of 3 hours on the other minimum wage proposals. At this point, the committee is planning to hold a work session on the bill on Monday, May 1st, to see if they might be able to come up with some commonality around reinstatement of the tip credit. I don't think anything's going to happen with the other minimum wage issues right now. I think that the legislature is split. I think some people would like to do it, but not something about it, but not enough, because the other folks feel like they have time to address it down the road. You know, there's not another increase until January 1st of 2018, where we'll go to $10 an hour. And then a lot of people think, well, maybe next year, because it seems to be the hurdle that's identified most problematic is when the minimum wage in Maine goes above $10 an hour.
Well, I want to start to talk about, because in this program, as in the legislature this year, a lot of time has been spent on the citizens' initiative process. Last year, we saw 5. As you very ably described, only one of those really failed. The rest passed, and they're in various forms of trying to address the public will, but also to do what's right for the economy and the people of Maine. I want to spend some time on that, but first, let's take a break. Welcome back to The Bottom Line. Today, with the help of my staff at the Maine State Chamber of Commerce, our advocacy team, I should say, we're taking a look at this legislative session, where we stand on issues, what we're talking about, and what we're going to do in the couple of months remaining. In the first segment, we talked about where we stand, which is more the norm, and we left off really talking about the citizens' initiative process. It has been the basis for a lot of the discussion in the first part of this legislative session, but there's a real interest in looking at the process, not to eliminate the process for sure, but to look at it to improve it, to be sure that what we're doing does represent what was intended when it was put in place years and years ago. So let's pick up the action right there. And Ben, I'm going to turn it to you, because this morning you were at a work session in which this was discussed. What was the theme of that? What was the feeling?
Definitely the theme is the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee is going to do something surrounding the referendum. There are more than 20 pieces of legislation dealing with changes to our referendum process. I think everyone saw last fall the 5 that came forward and the more that are developing. But out of the 20 pieces of legislation, they worked unanimously with a desire to report out a bill. They voted unanimously for 5 vehicles to make some changes to our referendum process. I think they're leaning towards doing something requiring increased percentage of vote. Right now we're at 10%. They're looking at maybe going to a 15% threshold in the gubernatorial or presidential election. Spreading those votes around, maybe either by county or congressional district. Right now, you can get all, if you wanted to, you could get all 60,000 signatures in the city of Portland. But they're going to require some sort of regional approach, so you're going to have to go to all parts of the state. And they're also going to look at, I think, gathering of the signatures, the paying per signature, which kind of creates a model of aggressive signature gathering and maybe even some fraud there as well. So I think all those issues got to be dealt with, and the committee is doing a really good job of working bipartisanly and unanimously together, because they know in order to impact the referendum process in the legislature, that's how it's going to have to be done. But there's a strong desire. There was no question in the committee this morning to do something to change our referendum, because I think everyone's in agreement that when this was, put into place in the 1800s, times have changed. We're in a different environment where a lot of out-of-state interest groups, can come in and for a few dollars make some major policy decisions on our ballot. And is that how we want to operate our state? And so there's definitely going to be some change coming with the referendum process. How that shakes out will be interesting over the next, 2 months. But definitely we could even see a constitutional amendment change on the ballot as well with our referendums. But there's no question, I think, when we adjourn in late June, there will be changes to our referendum moving forward.
Well, and I'm going to pick up on that point, excuse me, Linda, is if it is a constitutional amendment, which most are apt to be the improvements, or any changes, I should say, it'll need a 2/3 vote of the legislature and a vote of the public. So it's a process that's intended to be protective in nature, and for that reason, it's not intended to be easy to change. But to your point, you said it well, we've got to the point where it raises certain questions, both of fairness, but other issues as well, and so you're trying to avoid that. So I applaud them for the way they're approaching this, because it'd be so easy to say, I'm not going to touch it, it's really the way it's been. But we're seeing practices that are not working.
Absolutely, and no one wants to take the referendum right away from the people. I think that's a clear message that's being sent as well. But times have changed, so we have to change the process itself of how you get a question on the ballot, and in terms of what the thresholds are, what the barriers may be, and maybe we have to strengthen them, or also, change the focus of that.
Well,
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of legislators that I heard this session that were really troubled by the fact that policy is being made by these referendums, and they have to go in now and actually look at the policy and say, is this what we want for Maine?
Yeah.
So I think, Ben's right. It's really something that needs to be taken a look at, because the elected officials are elected. That's why we elect them.
Well, it's hard to argue that the priorities of this session were being set by the legislature themselves.
Yeah,
the reality is
Right.
the priorities have been set because of the referendum questions that passed. So it's taken now the ability to choose those priorities away from the legislature. And I think there are folks in the State House who recognize that absent changes to the referendum process, they're going to continue to lose the ability to really set their priorities. And instead, these will be driven for them, so they're only going to see more referendums, not less, and they're only going to have to take up more time during the legislative session to address the inadequacies of those referendum proposals from a statutory perspective.
And I heard a statistic last night in terms of the referendums I find fascinating, because everyone believes referendum passes and then it can't be changed by the legislature. We've passed since the early 1900s, somewhere around in the 60s.
70%.
So, yeah, 70% of referendums that have passed, which have been about 80 or so, have been changed by the legislature since they were passed. So this isn't, new ground that we're going over, or...
Yeah, and that's an issue that, frankly, until this session, I would have bought into the theory that you don't change. I mean, we know they changed in Gamlin, but I honestly had kind of forgotten that until I was reminded of it. And yet history tells us, you're right, 70% of those that are passed have been modified in the best interest of the state's economy or the people of the state. It's the responsibility of the legislature while respecting the intended will of the public. So yeah, again, I applaud them, and I think you brought that issue home. Let me just, we've only got about 5 minutes left, a little over 5 minutes. And last evening, we held what was referred to as a leadership summit follow-up. For our audience, they need to know that early in February, we bring legislative leadership and a number of other legislators to Sunday River. We get together with certain numbers of our business community, and we simply talk about issues. There's no agenda other than building relationships, gaining access, understanding each other's points of view. We give them some themes to talk about, and then we get together last night, during the middle of the session, happened to be last night, and bring in leadership, our 4 leaders, and they bring us up to date on where the issues are. Did any of you hear anything that you'd like to share about either positive or concerns you had that you heard last night? I'm anxious to hear what you have to say, because I haven't caught up with you, many of you, since last night.
Absolutely. I walked away last night very positive. I was very encouraged by how leadership was addressing issues, their willingness to work together. They were talking about the budget and the dialogue. Everyone has their priorities, I think, going into the budget session, but their willingness to give and take and to talk about coming to the table and working together, because they are doing that, I think, up to this point in this session, and they're going to continue to do that. So to hear them speak that all on the same table, from you have leadership from both bodies sitting around and talking about the next 2 months, and in the tone they were speaking, the tone of reaching across the table to those and coming up with solutions to problems, and not just, hashing out the problems. I walked away very positive and very encouraged that hopefully this budget season will come to fruition with not too much pain.
Yeah. I came away with the same impression, that they wanted to work together. We haven't heard a lot all session about that, but all of a sudden now we've heard it, and I think it's loud and clear. And I think, as appropriations meet over the next few weeks, the negotiations are going to be amped up tremendously, especially on the contentious issues that they have. So.
I thought that everything was on the table, listening to them last night. They agreed that all the different policy issues that are of the highest importance to the caucuses, everything was on the table in order to provide a solution. The reality is, that's a somewhat different message than we got in February, when people were much more, early on in the session, were hardened into their positions. And that's softened, and people have recognized that if we're going to accomplish something, and again, the referendum questions that pass really require action in some areas, we got to work together to do it.
Yeah. Well, Peter, we all get a little softer with age.
That's true.
Actually, just to follow up on that, when you said everything was on the table, I think that's a good way in the remaining 2.5 minutes we have. There were a number of things that were brought up, just kind of like in the lightning round, that were brought up in this session that I think in the few minutes we have, we just at least mention them. Education, Ben.
55%.
In terms of the task force that we heard about, workforce is a big issue for our state. It's the biggest imperative that we have, both skill and supply. An idea expressed last night that was kind of unique. It works well with the coalition that's been formed between business and education.
Absolutely.
Talk a bit about that.
Senator Langley has a workforce coalition that is a task force. It's been formed through the legislature that is not going to look at the workforce issue from a study perspective, but look at real solutions to the problem, have different industry sectors in. Right now they're looking at the medical field and say, okay, what are the barriers to getting new employees, and what are the solutions to these problems, and how as policymakers can we help encourage that? So looking at a solution-minded focus, it's made up of members of both the legislature and the private sector of this task force, and I think they're going to create a model moving forward for different industry sectors to help us tackle probably one of the biggest issues facing our state is our workforce issue.
Yeah, no doubt. Pete, with a little over a minute to go, talk about any other workforce issues like paid sick leave or other things that might be on the table.
Well, paid sick leave and paid family medical leave have both been on the table. I don't see them going anywhere, but reflective of the workforce issues, there's a lot of discussion about how to get more people in the workforce, and one of the things that's being discussed is the issue around criminal records and criminal backgrounds. Not that the legislature is interested in preventing employers from doing criminal background checks, but rather, is there a place at some point in time, if someone's had a criminal conviction, that they could be considered for the purposes of employment or background checks, sort of protected from that background? And so there's 2 or 3 bills on that, and we'll see where that works out.
30 seconds, last word, Linda.
Income tax surcharge, overturning that. Better program, converting Better to BED-E over a 4-year period, important to business. Lowering of the corporate income tax, those are all things that are on the table right now.
We have a lot to do and 2 months to do it, but we're all encouraged by what we're hearing and what we're seeing. So that will be the final word. I thank you, team, and I'll be right back with my closing comments right after this. I'm sure you've heard these words before. So much to do, such little time. But I doubt if you've ever heard them applied to the legislative process, and that is before today in this program. Because you see, when you think about it, there's been 4 months that the legislature has been in session. There's 2 months to go. And with 17 to 1,800 bills, and admittedly, many, if not most of them, yet to be finally resolved, there is reason to use that phrase, so much to do, such little time. But Paul Harvey has the answer to that when he says, let me tell you the rest of the story. Because you see, every legislative session has its own personality, its own priorities. They come to the session as new legislators because it's the first year, new people elected. It's a tough job. You have to learn the routine as well as the responsibilities. And then you have all those bills, as was pointed out in today's program. Every one of them receive discussion, debate, and decisions. And they're complex, they're confusing, they're controversial, as today's program also pointed out. And up until this time, the legislature has not been able to really finalize or even negotiate the tough issues. But you know what? Up until this point, it's been about process, and process is very fundamentally important to the legislature. It's a time to listen. It's a time to learn. And there's a lot of division that gets focused on during that time. But here's what we have found out with time. Diversity is a strength, particularly when it comes to public policy. And the bottom line for this program today is that when you work together, success is yours. That is a value that cannot be overstated. And I believe with the leadership that we have in this session of the legislature, as well as its members, that will be the outcome. We will get results, it will be success, and we'll be proud of its outcome. I hope to see you back here sometime in the future, but you need to know that this is the final bottom line for Time Warner Charter Communications. And I do not want to leave without saying how much of a pleasure it has been to have the people behind the cameras in the control room to work with us. They are a professional crew. They're wonderful to work with. They bring out the best even in me, and that's a tall order. Most of all, they have given us a gift of friendship. We can't thank them enough. I thank them. I thank you for the pleasure of your listening and your attention. We will be back, bottom line, in a different place at a different time, and we'll let you know when that is. Until then, have a wonderful time. Take care.